Today we're looking at factoring trinomials in the form x squared plus bx plus c. Now when factoring a trinomial in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where a equals 1, we don't have to go through the entire factoring by grouping process. There is a shortcut. But remember, this will only work if your a is 1, or there's kind of an invisible 1 here. If there's not a number here, then you know you can start. So let's look at example 1. First thing you're going to look at is you're going to look right here. There's not a number. And so you're going to look for two numbers that add to 8 and multiply to 15. So first thing you're going to do is you're going to write 15 off to the side, and you're going to think about numbers that multiply to 15. And you want them to also add to 8. So I have 1 and 15. 2 doesn't go into 15 because it's not an even number. 3 does. 3 and 5 make 15. Now if I add 3 plus 5, that is going to give me my 8. So what's going to happen is I'm going to have an x plus 3 and an x plus 5. Now I want to show you what happens if you were to factor this by grouping. So we took 1 times 15 is 15. We're looking for two things that add to 8. That would be 3 and 5. So we have x squared plus 3x plus 5x plus 15. We put in our lightning bolt. The first two have an x in common. The second two have a 5. Bring down the sign. And then we have x plus 3. We have an x plus 3 and an x plus 5. So you could put this as x plus 3 or x plus 5, but you're just going to put in parentheses an x and an x, and then the two numbers that you got that we're adding to the 8. So let's go to this shortcut for number 2. Now, if you notice, this is not in standard form. So the very first thing I need to do is write it in standard form. We want the y squared, then the y, then the constant number at the end all by itself. So this would be y squared plus 6y plus 5. First we learn to add, then we learn to multiply. We're looking for two things that multiply to 5. Add to 6. 1 times 5 is 5. 1 plus 5 is 6. So we put our two parentheses. Since our variable is a y, we put a y and a y, and then we have a plus 1 and a plus 5. And you can always check this to make sure you get the answer you started with. Y times y is y squared. Y times 5 is 5y. And 1 times y is 1y. When you add those together, you get 6y, and 1 times 5 gives you the 5 at the end. Now, number 3, we're looking at, we have first you learn to add, then you learn to multiply. You're looking for two numbers that multiply to 6 and add to negative 5. Now, because it's a positive 6, the two numbers have to be the same, a positive and a positive, or a negative and a negative. But since this is a negative number, we're going to make both of them negative. So we have either 1 and 6 or 2 and 3. Both numbers are going to be negative because this number is negative. Now negative 1 minus 6 is a negative 7, so that is not going to be our answer. We are going to use the negative 2 and the negative 3. So we put two parentheses. Whatever variable we have, we put those in the first spot of each parenthesis, and then we use our two numbers, a negative 2 and a negative 3. And when you multiply this out, you get x squared minus 5x plus 6. Number 4 is not in standard form. We want the b squared first, then the b, then the number at the end. So b squared minus 9b plus 18. First you learn to add, then you learn to multiply. You're looking for two numbers that multiply to 18 and add to negative 9. It is a negative 9, so both of them will be negative because a negative times a negative gives us that positive 18, and we want them to add to a negative 9. I'm thinking the negative 3 and the negative 6 will add to a negative 9. we put our two parentheses. In the first spot, we have a b and a b, a -3 and a -6. And that would give us our answer. Number 5, we're going to just get it in standard form. We want the z squared first, then the 3z, then the -10. First we learn to add, then we learn to multiply. We're looking for two numbers that multiply to -10 and add to +3. So one of these is going to be negative and one is going to be positive, but since they're adding to a positive number, the bigger number is positive. So we have 1 and 10, 2 and 5. The bigger number is positive, the smaller number is negative. 5 minus 2 gives us the 3. Put our two parentheses, z minus 2, z plus 5. Number 6, it's in standard form. I'm looking for, first we learn to add, then we learn to multiply. We're looking for two things that multiply to -12, add to a +1. Since the 12 is negative, we're going to have one positive and one negative to get a negative number. 1 and 12, but we have a positive number we're looking for. So the bigger number is positive and the smaller number is negative. 2 and 6, 3 and 4. Now we want them to add to a +1. We have our two parentheses. 4 minus 3 is 1, so those are our two numbers. We have x and x, a -3 and a +4. Number 7, we want to get it in standard form. It is not right now. We want the x squared, then the x, then the number at the end. So we have x squared minus x minus 20. Now first we learn to add, then we learn to multiply. We're looking for two numbers that multiply to -20. Now if there's not a number in front of the x, it's a 1. So we want them to add to be a -1. Now since the two numbers multiply to be a negative number, to get a negative number, we have one negative number, one positive number, and the bigger number has to be negative to get a negative when you add them. So we have 1 and 20, 2 and 10. 3 doesn't go in evenly to 20, but 4 and 5 do. The bigger number is negative, the smaller number is positive, and then we're looking for which ones add to a -1. That would be 4 minus 5 equals a -1. We put our two parentheses, x and x, plus 4 minus 5. Okay, last one like these. We have, first we learn to add, then we learn to multiply. It's in standard form, so we don't need to rewrite it. We're looking for two numbers that multiply to -18. So we have one negative number, one positive number, but when we add them together, we get a negative number. So the bigger number is going to be negative. I'm going to write all my factor pairs, 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6, where the bigger number is negative. -6 plus 3 gives us a -3. So I put my two parentheses, plus 3 minus 6. Okay, now we're going to use we're going to factor each expression by first factoring out the greatest common factor. Now, when you are ever factoring, the very first thing you want to look for, is there a number that will evenly divide into all of the numbers? Now, this first one, all of them are even, and any even number will be divisible by 2. So I'm going to pull a 2 out of the factors, which means I'm going to divide 2 by each of these numbers. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So 1x squared we can just write as x squared. 22 divided by 2 is 11x, and 60 divided by 2 is 30. Now I'm going to just kind of ignore the 2. I'm going to bring it down, but I'm just going to kind of pretend like it's not part of the problem. And I'm only going to focus on this part. I'm going to use the shortcut on this. So to use the shortcut, first we learn to add, then we learn to multiply. We're looking for two things that multiply to 30 and add to 11. Now 30 is positive, so they're both going to either be positive or negative. Since we're adding to be a positive number, they both have to be positive. 1 times 30, 2 times 15, 3 times 10, 4 does not go in. 5 goes in 6 times. And when I add 5 and 6, I get the 11. So I'm going to put my 2 parentheses, plus 5, plus 6. And that, make sure that 2 is part of your answer. Okay, number 10, we want to think of a number that will evenly divide into 3, 12, and 36. I'm also noticing this is this first number is negative. I never want a negative in that first position. If there is, you always need to pull the negative out of the parentheses. Now 3 will go into all 3 numbers. So I'm going to factor out a negative 3, which just means I'm going to divide all of these by 3. I'm also noticing that each piece has an x. So I'm going to also bring out an x as well. Now, if I took negative 3x cubed and divide it by negative 3x, the negative 3's cancel, and one of the x's cancel out, which is going to give me an x squared left over. Now I'm going to now I pulled out a negative sign, which is going to change this plus right here to a minus, because a negative times a negative will equal that positive there. And negative 3 times negative 4 will give us the 12, and x times x gives us x squared. Our last piece is the 36x. So if I divide 36 by negative 3x, 36 divided by negative 3 is negative 12, and the x's cancel out. So I'm going to have a negative 12. Now I want this minus 3x to be part of my answer. So I'm just going to make sure I bring that down, but I'm going to ignore it for the rest of the problem. I'm only looking at this piece, and I'm going to use the shortcut. So first you learn to add, then you learn to multiply. I have two things that multiply to negative 12 and add to negative 4. 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. 1 is going to be positive and 1 is going to be negative, and since they add to a negative number, the bigger number has to be negative and the smaller number has to be positive. So we're looking for 2 that add to negative 4, which would be a positive 2 and a negative 6. I put 2 parentheses, x and x, a plus 2 minus 6. Now we're going to go ahead and solve each equation using our zero product property. Now I cannot solve this if it has all plus and minuses. If you have a squared, what you need to do is you have to get it into two things that are multiplying, because then we know if two things multiply together and the answer is 0, then one of the two pieces have to be equal to 0. So we can use our shortcut. First we learn to add, then we learn to multiply. We look for two things that multiply to 40, add to negative 13. It's a positive 40. So two things that they either have to both be positive or both be negative. But since they're going to add to be a negative number, all of the numbers are going to be negative. So I have negative 1 and negative 40, negative 2, negative 20, negative 3 doesn't go in, 4 does, negative 4 and negative 10, negative 5 and negative 8, 8 plus negative 8 and negative 5 add up to negative 13. So those are my two numbers. I have x and x, a minus 5 and a minus 8. So I'm looking at, this is set equal to 0. So if two things are multiplied and they the answer is 0. Either this one has to equal 0, x minus 5 has to equal 0, or this piece has to equal 0, x minus 8 equals 0. So x, what number minus 5 equals 0? X could equal a 5, or x could equal an 8. And both, you can check those, and both of those will work out and give you a 0 if you plug it in for x. On number 12, same thing. First we learn to add, then we learn to multiply. We're looking for two things that multiply to -6 and add to -5. Since this is a negative number we're multiplying to, we're going to have one positive and one negative number multiplies to -6. Now we're adding to a -5, and since this is a negative number, the bigger number is negative. So 1 and -6, and right there, I see that those are the two numbers, so I don't have to write any more down. So I'm going to write my parentheses, x plus 1 and x minus 6 equals 0. If two things multiply to equal 0, we know either the first one has to equal 0 or the second one has to equal 0. Now, what number plus 1 equals 0? X would equal a -1 here, and x would equal a positive 6 here. 6 minus 6 equals 0. Number 13, we have 3b squared plus 3b minus 18 equals 0. Now, I'm looking here and I am seeing that all three of these numbers are divisible by 3. So I want to make sure I pull the 3 out. I divide all pieces by 3. I have 3b squared. I have b squared plus 3 divided by 3 is 1, so b, and -18 divided by 3 is -6. Now we're going to just ignore the 3 here. We're going to ignore the equals 0 as well. And we're just going to, first you learn to add, then you learn to multiply. We're looking for two things that multiply to -6. Add, if there's not a number, it's a positive 1. So I have 1 and 6, 2 and 3. It's a positive 1, which means the bigger number is positive, and a -6, we need one positive, one negative. So the smaller numbers are going to be negative here. 3 minus 2 is what's going to give me the positive 1. So I don't have x. I have, make sure you use the right variable. You have b minus 2 and b plus 3. We're going to set each piece equal to 0. Now 3 will never equal 0, so I'm not going to set that equal to 0. But b minus 2 could equal 0, and b plus 3 could equal 0. I add 2 to both sides, I get b equals 2. I minus 3 to both sides, I get b equals -3. So those are going to be my two answers. Looking at number 14, I see all three terms are divisible by 3. And I notice that each term has an m in it. So I'm going to divide each piece by a 3m, which leaves me with an m squared minus 6m minus 40. Now I'm going to just ignore the 3m for just a minute. I'm just going to bring that down. I'm also going to bring down the equals 0. I'm going to use my easy shortcut factoring. First we learn to add, then we learn to multiply. I'm looking for two things that multiply to -40 and add to -6. So I've got 1 and 40, 2 and 20, 3 does not go in, 4 and 10. And we're looking, I also have 5 and 8. We did this just a minute ago. I'm looking for two things that add to -6. Now, one of these, they're multiplying to be a -40. So one's positive, one's negative, and they add to a negative number. So that means the bigger number has to be negative, the smaller number has to be positive. Now, 4 minus 10 gives me that -6, so I'm going to have m plus 4 and m minus 10. I'm going to set each piece equal to 0. 3m equals 0. M plus 4 equals 0. And m minus 10 equals 0. 3 times m equals 0. If I divide both sides by 3, m has to equal 0. I minus 4 from both sides, m equals negative 4. And I add 10 to both sides, m equals positive 10. Now the fundamental theorem of algebra tells us that whatever your highest power is, that's going to tell you how many solutions. And we have 3 solutions here.